Hello and welcome to another Cliff Reviews Art House. This time I'm reviewing the film Beetlejuice, directed by Tim Burton. I recently watched and reviewed the original Beetlejuice film, and at the end I just wasn't convinced that this film in any way calls for a new one to be made. But I went to see the new one anyway, and I was right. We don't need another Beetlejuice film. It's actually had some really good reviews, this film, so clearly the fan base like it. It's just one of those films that I have to accept isn't for me. But I will try and articulate why it is that I really didn't enjoy it. Perhaps I can start with what I did like about this second Beetlejuice film. I actually really liked the opening scene where we see the Winona Ryder character Lydia on her own TV show. I thought, oh, maybe this film's going to be better. It was relatively short-lived, that scene, but it did serve the purpose of telling us what had happened to Lydia in the past 36 years. I'm of an age now where there's a real nostalgic hit from seeing characters from more than 30 years ago brought back and played by the same actors. There's a lot of references to the first film. In fact, there's a lot of kind of repeated scenes with exactly the same set. I went with someone who hadn't seen the original, so I enjoyed seeing all of the references that he didn't know. The other thing that made me smile was the Soul Train scene, again for a kind of nostalgic reason. As I said in my review, I did think that the original Beetlejuice hasn't aged well, and the second film obviously looks much better. However, although I like the nostalgic elements of repeating much of the scenery from the first, it just looks better. It doesn't really do anything new with it. There's a bit of humour in the first film in Hell's Waiting Room. It could even be argued that it's a metaphor for unnecessary bureaucracy and administration. But in Beetlejuice, it's repeated, but only half-heartedly. There's nothing new or fresh. I guess if you love the first, giving you more of the same makes you happy. But for me, overall, this just doesn't work. The Maitlands aren't in the film again, so no cameo for Alec Baldwin or Geena Davis. But that's a good thing, I think. Their characters are so weak in the first film, and they're almost the main characters in the film. We have plenty of new people in this film. Lydia's daughter, played by Jenna Ortega. The detective, played by Willem Dafoe. The love interest, Jeremy. A Danny DeVito cameo. They're all not bad, but there's a real problem with the story, I think. There's too many different strands of the story going on. There's Beetlejuice's ex trying to get revenge on him. There's Lydia's daughter and the love interest with Jeremy. And there's the continuing story of Lydia and Beetlejuice. It's just all too much, all too easily resolved, and all not interesting enough. In fact, the story's just silly, I think. Perhaps I'm expecting too much. Perhaps it's just supposed to be a fun film, not to be taken too seriously. If that's the case, okay. But there are some good characters here, played by some great actors. It seems that more could have been done. One point I read in one of the critiques was the creepiness of the Beetlejuice character trying to marry a minor in the original. I didn't stop to think about this when I watched the original, but it's absolutely true. So there's still something slightly uncomfortable about that story being continued, even though Lydia is now much older. Beetlejuice, for me, is just such an uninteresting character, well played by Keaton, really creative in a disgusting way, slightly amusing at times, slightly, but overall not a nice character, no redeeming features. Not exactly a great villain, just not nice or interesting. One of my biggest problems with the first Beetlejuice film was the Deo song scene. I just found this total cringe. At the beginning of the second film, we have a funeral where the Deo song is playing. I'm sure that this was supposed to be funny, but it felt like at any moment the cast were going to start singing involuntarily in the same way as in the first film. What a relief that it didn't happen, but I had a high level of anxiety while it was hanging in the air that it might happen. Instead, we get a repeat of the scene at the end of the film with a new song, MacArthur Park. I actually thought this was much more entertaining than that first ridiculous scene. But still, it reminded me too much of the experience of watching that awful Deo scene in the film to be really able to enjoy it. In looking up what people have been saying about the film, I saw some interesting comments on TikTok about the Soul Train scene. Of course, Tim's often been criticised for the lack of racial diversity in his films. His films are on the whole very white. I quite enjoyed the Soul Train scene in the cinema, but through a different lens, I do realise that it's highly problematic. I should have picked up on this, like the inappropriateness of Beetlejuice wanting to marry a minor. It does feel like this is a heavy-handed, clumsy attempt to make a joke about this, incorporating an iconic show, having a scene of black people all dressed in stereotypical 1970s costumes dancing on the platform. Tim Burton's been defensive about the lack of ethnic diversity. And I don't want to get too controversial here, but this is one of those cases where a person probably isn't racist, but ends up being quite racist. This is what institutional or structural racism is. I read some of his comments defending his use of white actors, and I did balk a little at kind of the implicit racism. It's so easy for white people to dismiss points like this as being politically correct, being woke, but I think that there are some genuine points here. In Beetlejuice, he uses very stereotypical black people from a blaxploitation movie. It's hard to see this as anything other than a middle finger to his critics. I mentioned that the person I saw it with hadn't seen the original, and I wondered if you needed to have seen the original to enjoy the second film. He didn't love the film, but he quite enjoyed it, and he felt that it all made sense, that things that needed to be explained were explained. Overall, I respect the fact that people enjoy this Beetlejuice world. It's definitely not for me. I probably did enjoy the second film a little bit more than the first film, but my concluding thought was that it was a sequel that we definitely didn't need. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.